Welcome to Unsolved Cases by Skoob, the podcast that dives deep into the murky depths of true crime. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and today we're traveling to a small island in Thailand that was once known as a tropical paradise, but has since earned a much darker reputation. This is the story of Koh Tao, an island where palm trees cast shadows over unspeakable violence, where justice seems as elusive as the morning mist, and where the line between paradise and nightmare becomes terrifyingly thin. Picture this: crystal clear waters, pristine beaches, swaying palm trees, and the promise of adventure in Southeast Asia. Koh Tao, meaning Turtle Island in Thai, was supposed to be a backpacker's dream, a place where young travelers could experience the beauty of Thailand's islands while diving in some of the world's most spectacular waters. But, as we'll discover today, beneath this picture-perfect surface lurked something sinister. Something that would transform this island paradise into what many now consider a death trap for tourists. Our story begins with two young British travelers, Hannah Witheridge, a 23-year-old from Great Yarmouth, and David Miller, a 24-year-old from Jersey. They arrived on Koh Tao in September 2014, just like thousands of other backpackers seeking adventure and natural beauty. They had no idea they were walking into what would become one of Thailand's most controversial and internationally scrutinized murder cases. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. Hannah and David weren't isolated incidents. Their deaths would eventually be linked to a pattern of suspicious fatalities on this small island, raising questions that continue to haunt investigators, families, and anyone seeking the truth about what really happens on Koh Tao. Let me set the scene for you. It's the night of September 14, 2014. Hannah and David are enjoying what should have been a typical evening in paradise: drinks at the local bars, meeting fellow travelers, soaking in the laid-back island atmosphere. The AC bar, where they spent their final hours, was a popular hangout spot for tourists. But according to sources close to the investigation, something disturbing was happening that night that most people didn't realize. Through my research, I've uncovered some deeply troubling details about Hannah's final hours, details that suggest this wasn't just a random act of violence. An investigator working on the case was particularly interested in finding evidence of any harassment Hannah might have encountered at the bars that night. This wasn't just casual inquiry. There were serious concerns about what had happened to her before the murders took place. Here's where the story takes an even darker turn. According to a witness who was actually on the island that night, someone who was initially willing to talk but later became too frightened to provide testimony, Hannah's drink had been spiked with rohypnol. Think about that for a moment. This means that what people might have interpreted as Hannah being extremely intoxicated was actually her being drugged against her will. This witness claimed she had been at the bar alongside Hannah and David and knew the employees at the AC bar. But when it came time to provide formal testimony, fear took over. Despite initial promises to cooperate with investigators, she ultimately refused to share what she knew, stating concerns for her safety. This pattern of witnesses becoming too afraid to speak would become a recurring theme in this case. The Daily Mail reported on September 21, 2014, about speculation of an altercation at the AC bar on the evening before the murders, a confrontation with a local criminal that may have sealed Hannah and David's fate. But finding concrete evidence of this altercation would prove nearly impossible, partly because potential witnesses were too terrified to come forward. To understand what really happened on Koh Tao, you need to understand the island's power structure. This isn't your typical tourist destination with straightforward law enforcement and local government. Koh Tao operates under a different set of rules entirely. The island's control lies not with official authorities, but with influential families who were among the earliest settlers. These families, referred to locally as the mafia, don't fit the Hollywood stereotype of organized crime. Instead, they operate more like a tribal governance system, where the head of each Thai village, called the Phyo Ban, wields enormous influence that often overshadows official authority. One family in particular, the Witheridges, had significant business interests spreading throughout Seri Beach. Their influence was so pervasive that both residents and police openly acknowledged the presence of this mafia on Koh Tao. This wasn't whispered about in dark corners. It was an accepted reality of island life. But here's what makes this system particularly dangerous for tourists. This localized power structure operates independently from formal authorities like police or government officials. When something goes wrong, when someone crosses the wrong people, the consequences can be swift and brutal. By 2017, the international media had begun to take notice. Elaine Dickinson, a former Thailand resident writing for the UK's Independent, published an article revealing Koh Tao's dark side, warning tourists to stay away from the island entirely. She painted a stark picture of an island overshadowed by a mafia-like family that demanded protection money, manipulated local police, and enforced their will through intimidation and property destruction. The Sun newspaper echoed these concerns, with their writer expressing a personal resolution never to return to Koh Tao. Think about that. Professional journalists, people who make their living investigating dangerous situations, were publicly stating that this island was too dangerous to visit. When Hannah Witheridge and David Miller's bodies were discovered on September 15, 2014, the Thai authorities knew they were facing a case that would draw international attention. Over 60 police officers were deployed to Koh Tao, led by Police Lieutenant General Panya Maman, who would spearhead what was supposed to be a thorough and uncompromising investigation. From the very beginning, General Maman's team suspected a connection between these murders and the influential families on the island. This wasn't based on wild speculation. They had evidence, they had CCTV footage, and they had identified specific suspects. On September 23, 2014, Thai PBS reported that an arrest had been made. The suspect was Mon, a member of the influential Tuvichian family. General Maman identified Mon as the primary suspect and issued a manhunt for Mon's nephew, known as Nomsod or Warat, who had mysteriously fled the island immediately after the murders. Here's what makes General Maman's statements so significant. He explicitly stated that both suspects had been captured on CCTV and that sufficient evidence was available to implicate them in the murders. This wasn't a fishing expedition. They had concrete evidence pointing to specific individuals. But General Maman made another statement that, in hindsight, seems almost prophetic. He repeatedly assured the public that no scapegoats would be used in the case, given the international scrutiny it was receiving. He warned that anyone assisting the suspects in evading arrest would face legal consequences. He dismissed the notion that local mafia or influential figures could interfere with the investigation. Why would a seasoned police general feel the need to repeatedly emphasize that scapegoats wouldn't be used? Was this based on past experience? Was he anticipating pressure from above? Or was he perhaps sending a message that he would resist any attempts to derail the investigation? According to reports, Nomsod had managed to leave the island shortly after the murders, traveling to the mainland at Surat Thani before disappearing entirely. 10 days after the tragic events, General Maman told the media that DNA results from the crime scene were expected within 48 hours and that they would provide strong, irrefutable evidence to apprehend the killers. The entire investigation was unfolding under intense international pressure, with the world watching to see if Thailand could deliver justice for two young tourists who had simply been seeking adventure in paradise. And then, something extraordinary happened. Or rather, something extraordinary didn't happen. Despite General Maman's confident assertions about having evidence against Mon and Nomsod, despite the CCTV footage and the DNA tests, the investigation suddenly took a completely different direction. By October 2, 2014, authorities had arrested two Burmese migrant workers, Zaw Lin and Phyo. These weren't the suspects General Maman had been pursuing. These weren't the people captured on CCTV. These weren't Mon or Nomsod. What happened to change the entire trajectory of the investigation? Where was the evidence against the original suspects? Why had the focus shifted from influential local families to vulnerable migrant workers? Initially, other tourists had also fallen under suspicion. Christopher Ware and his brother Jimmy, Friends of David Miller, who had been traveling with him, were detained and prohibited from leaving Thailand, while police conducted DNA tests. Christopher Ware, a carpenter and longtime friend of Miller's, expressed genuine fear that he might be wrongfully implicated by authorities who were under enormous pressure to solve the crime. In phone conversations with friends back in Jersey, Ware maintained his innocence but expressed deep concern about being framed. His friends reported that he was worried the Thai police might blame him for the crime simply to expedite their investigation. These weren't unfounded fears. The pressure to solve this high-profile case was immense. Friends defended Ware's character passionately, with schoolmate Aaron Higgins vouching for him and describing the close friendship between Ware and Miller. Another supporter, Siobhan Philippe, emphasized Ware's popularity and decency, asserting that neither he nor his family would ever betray a friend. Ultimately, the suspicions surrounding the Ware brothers proved unfounded. They were cleared and allowed to return home, but their experience highlights the desperate search for suspects and the willingness of authorities to cast a wide net in their investigation. So how did the investigation shift from influential Thai families to Burmese migrant workers? This is where the story becomes even more troubling, because it reveals the vulnerability of Myanmar's migrant worker population in Thailand. Zhao Lin, known as Zoran, and Phyo, known as Win, were among thousands of Burmese workers who had come to Thailand seeking better economic opportunities. They were young, poor, and far from home. In other words, perfect scapegoats if you needed to solve a case quickly and quietly. But here's what's particularly disturbing about their arrests. They initially confessed to the crimes, but later retracted these confessions, claiming they had been coerced through torture and threats. This pattern of confessions followed by retractions citing police brutality is unfortunately common in Thailand's justice system, particularly when dealing with vulnerable populations like migrant workers. The international community began to take notice of these developments. Human rights organizations raised concerns about the treatment of the defendants and the reliability of evidence obtained through potentially coercive means. The case was becoming not just about two tragic murders, but about Thailand's justice system itself. Meanwhile, what had happened to the original investigation into Mon and Namsad? That evidence General Maman had been so confident about seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The CCTV footage, the DNA evidence, the strong case he had built against the influential family members, all of it was apparently forgotten as the focus shifted entirely to the two Burmese workers. The trial of Zhao Lin and Phyo became an international spectacle, with human rights observers, journalists, and legal experts closely monitoring the proceedings. The case was heard at the Koh Samui Provincial Court, and the charges were severe: murder, gang rape, theft, and illegal entry into Thailand. The prosecution's case relied heavily on DNA evidence. They claimed that DNA found at the crime scene matched the defendants, and that this evidence had been collected and tested according to international standards. According to the court documents, DNA found in Hannah Witheridge's body matched both defendants, with over 16 instances of DNA matching documented. But here's where things get complicated. The defense raised serious questions about the chain of custody for this DNA evidence, the methods used to collect and test it, and the reliability of the results. They argued that the evidence had been contaminated or potentially fabricated. The prosecution also presented evidence that Phyo had attempted to sell David Miller's mobile phone shortly after the murders, suggesting his involvement in the theft. This seemed like strong circumstantial evidence, but the defense questioned whether this proved involvement in the murders themselves. Throughout the trial, Zhao Lin maintained his innocence on all charges except illegal entry into Thailand. Phyo admitted only to being in Thailand illegally, but denied involvement in the murders or sexual assault. On December 25, 2015, Christmas Day, the Koh Samui Provincial Court delivered its verdict. Both defendants were found guilty of all charges. They were sentenced to death for the murders of Hannah Witheridge and David Miller. The court stated that the DNA evidence was conclusive and met international standards for reliability. They found that this evidence, combined with circumstantial evidence, proved beyond reasonable doubt that the defendants were responsible for the sexual assault and murders. But this verdict didn't end the controversy. If anything, it intensified it. Human rights organizations, legal experts, and many members of the international community expressed serious concerns about the fairness of the trial and the reliability of the evidence. The murders of Hannah Witheridge and David Miller might have been shocking, but they weren't isolated incidents on Koh Tao. As international attention focused on the island, other suspicious deaths began to surface, painting a picture of an island where tourist deaths were disturbingly common. In April 2017, another tragedy struck. Elise Dalemain, a Belgian tourist, was found dead on the island. According to Police Chief Polner Lieutenant Chokchai Sutimkek, her body was discovered on April 27th, hanging from a tree with a rope around her neck. The preliminary findings suggested she had died between April 23rd and 24th from lack of oxygen. Local authorities quickly ruled her death a suicide, but questions remained. Why had it taken so long to find her body? What had led a young woman on vacation to take her own life on what was supposed to be a tropical paradise? The case gained renewed attention when the Samui Times published Dalemain's story, and it was widely circulated on the CSILA Facebook account. This publicity pressure led Deputy Surat Thani, Police Chief Polaris Colonel Precha Kladsawad, to instruct Koh Tao Police to reopen the investigation into her death on June 30, 2017. But the pattern continued. Just weeks later, on June 17, 2017, another death rocked the island. Bernd Grotsch, a 47-year-old German national who was fit and healthy, was found dead in his bungalow in the island's densely wooded area. Initial statements from Thai authorities attributed his death to either a heart attack or a snake bite. Grotsch's family immediately harbored doubts about these explanations. Their suspicions grew when they didn't receive an autopsy report, and they discovered that his body had been sent to a Bangkok hospital with a tarnished reputation, the same hospital that had provided flawed reports in the Hannah Witheridge and David Miller case. Even more disturbing, the family was initially told that Grotsch's body had been transferred to Surat Thani on the mainland, but they later discovered it had remained at a temple on Koh Tao for several days. Only under intense pressure from the family and possibly intervention from the German embassy was the body eventually transported to Bangkok. It was speculated that Grotsch had returned to Koh Tao to conclude business matters related to a motorbike business he had owned on the island for nearly 2 decades. Had he crossed the wrong people? Had he known too much about what really happened on the island? As negative publicity about Koh Tao mounted, the island's residents found themselves caught in the middle of a growing international controversy. Some, terrified of speaking out, remained silent about what they knew. Others tried to fight back against what they saw as unfair characterizations of their home. On July 7, 2017, Claire Wyndham, identifying herself as the owner and manager of Koh Tao International Primary School and a long-term resident, started a petition on change.org titled "Hold Samui Times Responsible for Destroying Koh Tao's Tourist Trade." She criticized the negative press for damaging the island's tourism industry. But this response reveals something important about life on Koh Tao. Even those defending the island didn't deny the allegations about corruption and violence. Instead, they focused on the economic damage caused by the publicity. This suggests that many residents were well aware of the island's problems, but felt powerless to address them directly. Meanwhile, the fear among potential witnesses remained palpable. Remember our earlier discussion about the woman who initially agreed to provide testimony about what happened to Hannah at the AC bar. Her experience is illustrative of the climate of fear that pervaded the island. This witness had initially told investigators that she had information about Hannah's drink being spiked and about the harassment she had faced. But when it came time to speak with investigators, she completely changed her story. She claimed she had never seen Hannah and had no relevant information to share. When pressed, she admitted she did have information, but was absolutely resolute in her decision not to share it. The investigator wondered if her fears might have been eased with promises of relocation, similar to assurances given to Burmese migrant workers willing to testify. But no such protection was offered, and valuable testimony was lost to fear. This pattern of witnesses becoming too frightened to testify suggests a systematic intimidation campaign designed to suppress the truth about what really happened on Koh Tao. What emerges from all of these individual stories is a picture of systematic obstruction of justice. This wasn't just about one or two bad actors. This was about an entire system designed to protect certain interests while sacrificing others. Consider the chain of events. General Panya Maman conducts a thorough investigation, identifies specific suspects from influential families, gathers CCTV evidence, and prepares to make arrests. Then suddenly, the entire investigation changes direction, focusing instead on vulnerable migrant workers who happen to confess after being detained and questioned. The original evidence against Mon and Namsad simply disappears from the narrative. No explanation is given for why these initial suspects are no longer being pursued. No clarification is provided about what happened to the CCTV footage that supposedly showed them at the crime scene. Meanwhile, the DNA evidence against the Burmese workers appears almost magically, despite questions about chain of custody and testing procedures. Bodies are moved without proper notification to families. Autopsy reports are delayed or go missing entirely. Witnesses are too afraid to testify. In November 2018, Police Major General Surachate Hakparn gave a statement to the New York Times, acknowledging past problems on Koh Tao, but claiming that the problematic elements that preyed on tourists had been removed from the island. But this admission raises as many questions as it answers. If these problematic elements existed, why weren't they properly investigated and prosecuted? If they preyed on tourists, how many other victims were there? The systematic nature of these cover-ups suggests coordination at multiple levels, from local police to regional authorities to the institutions responsible for processing evidence and conducting autopsies. As we close this episode of Unsolved Cases, the deaths on Koh Tao remain unresolved. 2 young tourists killed, 2 migrant workers convicted amid a cloud of doubt, and other suspicious deaths never fully probed. Who benefited from a rushed investigation? Who was silenced? And whose evidence vanished? If you think this story is finished, think again. New leads, witness accounts, and disputed forensics suggest the surface was barely scratched. Curious what was withheld and why? Download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story, detailed timelines, and exclusive bonus material. Share this episode to keep pressure on the search for truth. The victims deserve answers. We owe them that much.